This presentation is on Moral Issues in Japan by Haley Jones. Japan consists of many islands which are stretched out along the edge of Eastern Asia. While the islands are mostly made up of mountains, the temperature and weather ranges from tropical to cooler temperatures. Due to certain mainlands of Japan being overpopulated and industrialized, the air population is high, resulting in acid rain. Even though Japan as a country is much smaller than the United States, they still have the 10th largest population in the world. When one thinks about religion in the United States, they can name many different ones represented by its very diverse population. However, Japanese people typically adhere to two religions, often both, being Shintoism and Buddhism. Other facts include Japan only having a 4% obesity rate and a 5% unemployment rate. According to the CIA's online World Fact Book, Japan adheres to a healthy lifestyle and also a responsible lifestyle. In the past, Japan used to be run by an emperor who is now simply a symbol of the state. The current political structure to the Japanese government is the Prime Minister, who brings a parliamentary government to existence. Following only behind the United States, Japan has the second largest GDP in the world, with automobiles being one of the largest exportations they have. The largest influencing factor in the Japanese business is relationships. It is important that when one is conducting business in Japan, their focus remains on forming good and lasting relationships. Common ways in which these relationships are formed are through the plentiful social outing invitations business hosts will provide, often invitations to bars and drinking. It is considered rude to not accept the invitation and join them. When conducting business in Japan, all eyes are on the foreigners and their efforts, so it is important to adhere to Japanese business etiquette. Things to remember include not being aggressive, bowing before handshakes, shaking hands only when offered by the host, taking notes at the meeting, acknowledging all who are participating, waiting to be seated in one's assigned and ranked spot, and always bringing lots of business cards. When entering a business meeting, it is important to bring bilingual business cards, which include both Japanese and English writing on them. Additionally, it is important to dress conservatively, formally, in dark colors, and with shoes that can be easily taken on and off. The two moral principles which are likely to be violated while doing business in Japan are respect for rights and harm prevention. First, respect for rights as a moral principle to be upheld is not honored in Japan when it comes to women in the workforce. Japan is a country which values tradition, even in a modern world. Traditionally, gender roles were very similar to that of the United States, where women didn't work, and men made all major decisions. Although, while the United States has made much progress for women's rights across all spectrums of life, Japan still trails behind, with gender inequality in business being a major issue to this day. In the past 30 years, much progress has been attempted toward women and their rights in Japanese business, but still the respect of rights for women in Japanese business remains an issue. In 1985, the Japanese government enacted an Equal Employment Opportunity Law, which mandated that their companies make efforts to aid women's rights in business, whereas a 1999 amendment then required such efforts specifically in recruiting, hiring, promotions, and opportunities for women in business. It is true that more women are being hired in business for a number of important roles, but they are now being pressured to quit shortly into their career. The leading reason Japanese women end up leaving the workforce is to take care of their families. Examples of why they find this necessary to do so include lack of childcare options, housework needing to be done, and the men still working long hours and not being able to take care of their children as well as a shared responsibility. Much progress to making recent ideas is a reality still to be made for women in Japanese business. Second, harm prevention is another moral issue which one will find in Japanese business. In the 1950s, the Prime Minister at the time was very focused on rebuilding Japan's economy and set a plan to achieve just that. Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida enforced that large corporations offer lifelong jobs to workers who display loyalty to their company. The offer to potential employees was a success, as the economy in Japan is now thriving again. But the side effects of the pressure on loyalty are grim for Japanese workers. Beginning just about 10 years after this new employee and employer promise, workers started to take on levels of stress and sleep deprivation to the maximum threshold. Due to said levels of extreme stress, sleep deprivation, and excessive overtime worked, workers in Japan began to commit suicide and die of strokes and heart failure at an increased rate than would be found from average physical or mental health issues. Karoshi, which is occupational sudden death, is a major issue to this day, which employers in business in Japan have yet to combat. Due to the fact that young people often don't have as many family ties or obligations, young people in Japan in business are expected to put a lot of time into their careers. In December of 2016, the Japanese government enacted a Premium Friday plan. This is where employees get to leave work at 3:00 p.m. on the last Friday of every month. While this government initiative was a great idea, the first year in review remains not so successful. The main push for this initiative remains in denser populated areas, especially Tokyo, leaving only about 11% of the workforce choosing to participate. Additionally, the last Friday of every month is when employees are stressed about submitting their work, and they don't find it worth their while to leave work. Unfortunately, karoshi still remains an issue in Japanese business. Now that we have gone over the general issues which provide evidence of moral principles being violated in Japanese business, I will go through the steps 3 through 9 of the moral decision-making process for both issues. The first topic I will be evaluating on how to solve will be women in Japanese business facing gender inequality. Step 3. Relevant stakeholders. When looking into the issue of combating gender inequality in Japanese business, the relevant stakeholders include the company, management, employees, and business partners. Step 4. Stakeholder interests. First, the stakeholder interests of a company as a whole experiencing exclusion of women in Japanese businesses are high. The company is ultimately responsible for ensuring their employees are treated fairly. Therefore, powerful officials in the company should allocate the responsibility of fixing the issue with the managers, who are often working side by side with the employees and may be able to find a solution the best way. This leads to the next stakeholder, being managers. As previously mentioned, the managers have a direct role in enforcing rules and policies which affect women's rights in business. Additionally, the managers are responsible for treating all employees the same and looking after them in their work. This means that they should be picking up on issues as they arise. The next stakeholder is a given, being employees. Employees are either going to be the victims of female exclusion in the business or a coworker who is attributing to the problem. The coworker should be responsible for creating an environment where they don't suppress other people's rights, and the female employees need equal rights in order to support their family and advance in their career. Business partners are a stakeholder in this issue, as they will be directly interacting with the company in question. If the business partner does not value women in business, it will most likely negatively affect how they treat women representatives from the original company, or vice versa. In contrast, if that company treats women more equally in business, then their practices may be a positive example to the original company on how to solve their issue. Step 5. Alternative actions. Option 1. As a business in Japan, choose to ignore the issue of women not being treated equally in business, and keep going about regular male-dominated business without any adjustments. Option 2. As a business in Japan, decide to solve the issue of women not being treated equally in business with several contingencies in place. Efforts include offering a free or discounted childcare option on grounds, enforcing the hiring of at least 30% women in staff, and making some deserving women managers. Step 6. Pros and cons for each option. Option 1. The pros of Option 1 include the businesses in Japan not having to do anything different or change their routine, not having to spend money on child daycare, and not having to be tedious and monitor the ratio of male to female workers. The cons of Option 1 include having to adjust to doing business with women when dealing with other businesses that adhere to women having rights, having women submit formal complaints that they aren't being treated fairly, negatively affecting a female worker's life, and being viewed as a company who treats women unequally. Option 2. The pros of Option 2 include having a diversified workforce with more skills to access, being viewed as a company who supports women, and having employees who feel valued and in turn are more productive. The cons of Option 2 include having to spend money and resources on the child care benefit, having to monitor the female-to-male ratio of the workforce, and having to force Japanese business professionals to get used to a routine where women are powerful players. Step 7. Conflicting principles. Justice, being the obligation to do what is fair and just, is involved in this moral dilemma. When evaluating the situation of Japanese businessmen oppressing women in business, they are violating what is fair to women. The fair and just action would be to give women equal rights in business and accommodate them like men so they can work as equals. Even in the United States, there is still gender discrepancies in business, such as the pay gap. Next, in order for women to provide for their families beyond housework and childcare, they must become a professional and get a good job. Doing so would be self-improvement for Japanese business women. By not giving women the same rights as men, this is impeding on their self-improvement, which should not be something another person affects. Next, the golden rule is a conflicting principle in this scenario as well. The golden rule states to treat others as they should be treated. In today's day and age, most societies are accepting and enforcing that men and women should be treated equally, even if they don't necessarily adhere to it. Therefore, the Japanese businessmen should recognize that they need to treat women the same way that they are being treated. Step 8. Applicable principles. The main applicable principle in this moral dilemma is respect for rights. After researching the gender inequality issues women in Japanese business face, it is evident that not much effort has been exerted to do the right thing towards said women. Respect for rights is self-explanatory, as it involves being mindful of other people's basic rights. In business, women have the right to the same advantages and treatment as men, but the Japanese culture typically chooses to ignore the issue. Therefore, respect for rights is the main applicable principle. Step 9. Preferable action. After completing my moral decision-making analysis on the issue of women in Japanese business facing inequality, I am choosing option 2 as my preferable action. This option is to accommodate women in business. While it may be difficult for a while for Japanese businessmen to get used to treating women as equals, and more resources will have to be spent on upholding this promise to the women and offering child care options, the payoff in the end will be greater. Advantages to this option include being up to date on current business practices among Western culture, having a diversified and strengthened workforce, and having more satisfied employees. In addition, honoring women as equals to men in business will ensure that the moral principle, respect for rights, isn't violated. Next, I will complete the same moral decision-making process, steps 3 through 9, for the moral principle of harm prevention being violated by karoshi. Step 3. Relevant stakeholders. When looking into the moral issue of combating karoshi, the relevant stakeholders include the company, management, employees and coworkers, customers, and business partners. Step 4. Stakeholder interests. A company which loses an employee to karoshi is affected, as they now have to manage and deal with this situation, possibly face lawsuits, and replace that employee. Management and coworkers to the victim of karoshi are affected, as they now begin to worry about the same thing happening to them. They must now cover the work of their coworker they lost, and they may feel responsible that they didn't look out for the victim. Also, they may be sad about losing said person. Customers, business partners, and the community are all affected by karoshi, as they will likely reconsider their participation in business with the company in question. A company who loses an employee due to karoshi may be blamed for the death, or named an unethical business who people should not associate with. Step 5. Alternative actions. Option 1. As a business in Japan, choose to ignore the issue of karoshi and rely on the government to make changes which will combat karoshi. Option 2. As a business in Japan, enforce a maximum threshold of 50 hours in which any employee may work per week. Compromise solution. As a business in Japan, do not enforce any specific workplace policies to combat karoshi, but employ a wellness coach who will monitor the well-being of one's employees and intervene where necessary, including methods of mandated counseling. The wellness coach will also advocate to employees methods for their own stress reduction in the workplace and monitoring their own health. Step 6. Pros and cons for each option. Option 1. The pros of option 1 include not spending money and resources on combating karoshi and being able to let employees work long hours and accumulate the overtime, which will result from zero limits. Cons of option 1 include being blamed as a company for incidents of karoshi, losing other employees to karoshi when they see it as a way out of their stress, having to constantly hire and train new employees when karoshi rates remain high, having to participate in lawsuits between the company and the family of the victim of karoshi, and possibly losing business when customers, clients, business partners, vendors, and the communities decide that said businesses should not be associated with. Option 2. The pros of option 2 include less incidents of karoshi, being a business who is ethical and moral and cares for its employees, increasing job satisfaction for employees, and decreasing stress and negative health effects. The cons of option 2 include projects taking longer when employees are limited in the time allowed to work, possibly having to hire more employees to make up for the limited hours at work, spending money and resources on combating karoshi. Japanese citizens may not want to work for said company if they strive to work for long hours when trying to display loyalty and not go against traditional ways, and having to monitor those who actually adhere or don't adhere to the 50-hour workweek policy. Compromise solution. The pros of the compromise solution include not having to spend as much time and resources on combating karoshi, letting employees feel autonomy for the hours they want to work. Projects will take less time to complete with no work restraints. Being a leader in the Japanese business world with new methods to combat karoshi. Being able to see the symptoms of possible karoshi victims through wellness coach monitoring. And being able to decrease rates of karoshi. The cons of the compromise solution include having to hire and pay a wellness coach, employees getting upset when the wellness coach intervenes with their work flow and enforces certain restrictions or requirements of them, and employees leaving the business because they don't want to have someone watch over them so much at work. Step 7. Conflicting principles. Conflicting principles in this moral decision-making dilemma include reparation, respect for rights, and special care. Reparation, which means to repair and make up for the harm one has done, is involved in this process because karoshi is so prevalent in Japan that it may be unavoidable. Reparation for the things which happen in one's business comes with the territory of having a business, even if said business didn't do anything unethical to begin with. Respect for rights is involved, as ethical businesses should respect the rights of employees to make decisions. However, this moral principle should be overruled when harm prevention is possible and necessary. Lastly, special care is an applicable principle to the current dilemma of combating karoshi, as every business should always look out for their employees and take special care in their well-being and health. Step 8. Applicable principles. The two main applicable principles in this moral conflict are harm prevention and self-improvement. In this situation, prima facie standards apply to our moral principles. Typically, the average person will think of themselves before everyone else involved. While karoshi is not the result of one person's actions, I feel that the Japanese businesses as a whole are worrying about the self-improvement and profitability of the company. This in turn leads to allowing their workers to work to death. I feel that the issue of karoshi is one that is of such high risk and repercussions that harm prevention overrides self-improvement of the company or certain powerful individuals within a given company. Death by overwork, or death in general, is something which should not be taken lightly and should be prevented at the expense of a business. Step 9. Preferable action. After a complete moral decision-making analysis, I have concluded that the compromise solution is the preferable action. There are many reasons why this option seems to be the best choice in combating karoshi and employing harm prevention. Currently, it is still the preference of Japanese employees in business to overlook themselves and do what it takes to show their loyalty to the company. This proves an issue if a company were to place restrictions on hours able to be worked, as employees would feel they are too managed or restricted. For this reason and the many other cons of placing a 50-hour workweek restriction, I have excluded option 2 from my analysis. Additionally, as previously stated, harm prevention is an overruling moral principle, as the harm being discussed is death. This matter is too large of a risk to worry about pleasing a business with accessibility and loyalty of workers. Lastly, the compromise solution of hiring a wellness coach shows the following. The business is making ethical attempts to keep employees alive and well, karoshi rates should decline, and symptoms of karoshi will begin to become recognizable and preventable. The compromise solution appears to have the least risks and the greatest rewards.